Self-control is a very important topic that we have to talk about in this video because I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I've been compiling a lot of my research into a video essay on self-control. So today we're going to take a grand tour through some of the erroneous notions of self-control that I have a problem with that's been circulating around the internet for the past few decades. And also here's kind of like an alternative view on the idea of self-control. That I'm going to present to you in this video. We're going to take this from a rather brilliant book, a rather brilliant account on Greek sexuality, which is called the second volume of The History of Sexuality by Michel Foucault. So I'll be drawing a lot of ideas from that book in this video. So before we start, if you want to get your hands on, this is kind of like an announcement, if you want to get your hands on a video script for this video, it is now available for patrons as a perk. And also as a patron, you'll get all the footnotes for this script and all the recommended readings. Because on YouTube, it's kind of impossible to communicate like the sources of these ideas that I'm presenting to you guys. So if you want to get your hands on the script, you can trace down all the sources yourself. And if you're interested enough in the topic at hand, you can do some extra readings. Maybe you can even, reading to the arguments yourself. You can disagree with me. But here's sort of like where most of the thinking happens. So I tend to script my videos out before I present them to you guys on camera. And this is a really great way to support this project of mine and at the same time expand your own sort of list of readings. So a lot of you guys have been hounding me for recommendations. I feel like this is the best way for me to recommend books to you guys, is to compile a recommended reading list as a part of the script. And also, if you want to get early access to videos and if you want to get early access to my exclusive sort of like Saturday book reviews, that is also available for patrons. So that is available in the description down below, and I'm currently in the process of turning this project into a community-funded project, so a lot of great benefits are coming to you guys if you guys decide to contribute as a patron. But nevertheless, today we're going to address this age-old topic of discipline, or age-old topic of like, how do we stay self-disciplined in the modern world? How do we stay self-disciplined in this very, morally dubious time? How do we navigate through all the traps of, people teaching you the wrong things and you falling down a wrong rabbit hole? So today we're going to ground this discussion in a story that I'm going to tell you here. So I had an English teacher once when I was in high school, when I was still a confused human being. And this English teacher was known for her streak of skepticism. So she was always that skeptical lady that was skeptical of like how the school was running, was skeptical of the structure of the administration, was skeptical of current events, was skeptical of the material that the school wants her to teach to students. But I somehow gravitated towards her. And after every class and after every sort of like assembly, I'd go up to this teacher of mine, English teacher of mine, and I'd ask her questions like, what did you think of this thing? What did you think of this book, this current event, this person? And once after this whole year level assembly sort of deal, after everyone had left the hall, and during the assembly, the head of senior school was playing us a clip of Tony Robbins' I'm Not Your Guru documentary on Netflix, and he recommended it to us. And being the sort of like the skeptic, skeptically minded person, probably partly influenced by this English teacher, I went up to her after the assembly and asked her, what did you think of Tony Robbins, and what did you think of this this documentary? And she basically chuckled. She passed a chuckle and she said, this entire positive education, this positive psychology thing, it feels like it's turning into a religion without a God. It's turning into a religion without a God. And that's the entry point for today's discussion. Are you treating self-discipline as a religion without a God? Are you treating your self-help gurus, the content on the internet that you're consuming, are you treating them as mere advice, or are you treating them as doctrine? So the central idea here that I want to draw your attention to is that the premise of self-control is that there's a higher self and there's a lower self, and a higher self somehow needs to like conjure up all kinds of defenses and force, through force if necessary, to tame the lower self. It's this very kind of like reductive notion of like the superego, the id, and then the ego somehow has to balance these two opposing forces. Now, I want you to reflect upon your experiences of consuming these self-help content. Why is it the case that you know perfectly well, logically, you know perfectly well what you should do? You know perfectly well that you should probably meditate for a little bit every single day. You probably know that like you should probably wake up a little earlier. You probably know that smoking cigarettes is not good for you. You probably know that, doing certain things over the weekend is going to lead to a massive episode of, hangover for the next few days. You probably know that certain things are just not that productive to do, like being on your phone for a few hours. Yet, how is it a case that people still struggle with this element of self-control, even when, logically they know that they shouldn't be doing those things? So here's my argument here, is that the modern notion of self-control, or this idea that you need to develop this forceful ability to somehow suppress your lower self, this is actually, not a very productive strategy. Your idea of developing yourself into this ideal of a human being who's able to repress all lower urges, this is actually shooting yourself in the foot. This is an act of stupidity. This is actually decreasing the likelihood of you actually achieving any kinds of self-governance. Why is that the case? Because what's really funny is that in this discourse, in this sort of like social media discourse, this personal development discourse, self-control had in a sense turned from a means to an end into a means in itself. So means to an end, it means you're using the self-control to sort of use the self-control to achieve a certain end, being healthier, happier, being more productive, whatever, right? But then recently there's been a fetishization of this control, of this discipline. So you have a lot of people, I'm not going to name names here, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. These people hitting the gym 5 times a week. These people developing a very firm kind of moral code. I wake up 5 a.m. at 5 a.m. every morning, and I'm going to go on that run. And then their followers, they start doing the same thing. And they sort of develop this little clan of like people who are really strict with themselves. People who kind of like viewed discipline as a virtue in itself, view discipline as an element of constructing this ideal of a human being. Now that's going to sound rather familiar if you've done any readings into the Christian mode of morality, or this sort of like puritanical sort of mode of morality, where the entire system basically concerns itself with an imagined ideal of piety, of purity, of these religious ideals that are based in doctrines. And then whoever fails to live up to that ideal, they're subjected to judgment. Except this time, the deity is no longer God. The deity is in a sense the guru that you're following. I don't care who you're following on the internet. As soon as you catch yourself trying to live up to some ideal, as soon as you catch yourself trying to become that perfectly disciplined human being, whenever you catch yourself in one of these modes of like conflict with yourself because like, there's this lower self, there's this higher self. I want my higher self to succeed, but my lower self is pulling me back. Whenever you sense this sort of like splintering happening, this disintegration of your identity, you are falling into the trap of taking advice as doctrine. You're taking the advice of these gurus and you're sort of like facilitating them down into doctrines to live by, into these sort of like fixed ideas. And all of the followers of these in this specific community, they're in a sense subscribing to the same fixed ideas. So you never really thought about why you should meditate 20 minutes a day. You've never really thought about why you should go on a run every morning. You've never thought about the practical benefits of like waking up at 5 a.m. every morning. You're just kind of doing it like a monkey. And if you fail to do so, that's going to create a sense of guilt. So you've never really accustomed these pieces of advice to your own life. And that's why my English teacher said, this entire self-help business, this entire guru worshipping business, to her, it sounds like a religion without a God. Because it is a religion without a God, where doctrines were replaced by advice with no theological basis. So that's probably the central problem with the modern or the internet notion of self-control, of this idea of viewing discipline as a means in itself. Like, you got to be disciplined, and there's just sort of like this aspiration to be something that's other than yourself. So you turn completely against yourself, and you sort of have adopted your decision-making to another person, and you're like, man, that person's an expert in XYZ. Hence, I must adopt his mode of living. I must adopt his way of living as a philosophy for my life. And then you do that entire exercise, you become very close-minded, you become very self-righteous, you become very kind of like moralizing. You like to moralize and preach to people. And that's how you encounter a lot of these preachy people in the self-help circles. So they can be quite annoying. And if you don't want to be one of these people, well, here's an alternative way to consider self-control. So if you're familiar with classical Greek philosophy, then you're probably also familiar with this historical figure, this legendary figure of Diogenes. So Diogenes supposedly had a streak, had this history of excusing himself in public. And when I say excusing himself in public, I don't merely mean, he's taking a piss in public. No, he's literally excusing himself in public. And I wouldn't really go into detail here because it's probably going to get demonetized. But he had a streak of excusing, sort of like releasing himself in public. And as bad as that sounds, as sort of like horrible as that sounds, he's actually pushing a Greek idea, the Greek idea of tresis aphrodisia, into its logical extreme. So this Greek term tresis aphrodisia in English simply means the use of pleasure. So the use of pleasure is, in a sense, the central difference between this use of pleasure, this Greek idea of use of pleasure, and this Christian sort of morality, is that the Christian form of morality concerned itself with some authoritative fixed subject, some ideal that one must aspire towards, this fixed sort of systematic subject that one must adhere to. These fixed ideas of piety, of, thou shalt or thou shalt not, these fixed commandments that one must abide to or one must live up to. That's sort of like that's sort of the Christian idea of morality. You must adhere to these rules. For example, you must love thy neighbor. Thou shalt love thy neighbor. So there are all of these ideals that one must conform to be a good Christian. So if you want to be a pious person, if you want to be a good person, if you want to consider yourself as a decent human being, here's a list of rules that you must aspire towards. It's a turning against of yourself to conform to some higher ideals. Whereas the Greek idea of the use of pleasure, according to Foucault, which is the author of this account of Greek sexuality, the history of sexuality, the second volume of this entire history, he basically considered this Greek notion as a form of art. So it's an art of the use of pleasure. It is an art of noticing your personal needs based on from situation to situation. So you have to apply a lot of awareness to your situation and then experiment with your personal needs, desires, pleasures, and through a constant process of reflection and through a process of sort of like considering many aspects of this sort of morality of yours, at the end of the day or at the very end of this journey, you can probably achieve this proper moderate use of pleasure. So in a Greek tradition, people are not really concerned with like a fixed code of ethics. In fact, people were encouraged to sort of find their own codes of ethics of conducting themselves. People were encouraged to find their own rhythms of sexual activities, their own rhythms of consuming food, their rhythms of consuming medicine, their rhythms of like governing a city, for example. So these people were, in a sense, the sole concern of the Greeks, of the classical Greeks, was that their sole concern was not a fixed ideal, but their concern was moderation. So through this idea of testing, through this idea of reflection and contemplation, that's why philosophy was such a big part of Greek culture, through a process of reflection, contemplation, and sort of testing, sort of balancing your needs around, or sort of balancing the good and the bad within yourself through a moment-to-moment awareness of your sins, your desires, and your urges, and mingling that with your higher aspirations, and then somehow in the process of doing so, molding yourself into a moderate ideal, a person of moderation, so you can enjoy the pleasures of life, but you won't go overboard. You can enjoy, for example, the pleasures of, pleasuring yourself in public, but you wouldn't go overboard. You can enjoy perhaps a little drink over the weekend, but you wouldn't go overboard. There's not a fixed code of morality that says you shall not drink over the weekend, but you're simply comfortable with balancing these very intricate forces within yourself. So that's the Greek idea of self-control. Contrast that with your traditional view on the internet, where people tell you to be disciplined all the time, where people tell you that, if you don't wake up at 5 a.m. every morning, you're a loser. Now, throughout history, at least in an intellectual artistic domain, a lot of people had pretty bizarre habits, So a lot of people have subscribed to these like really funky habits. If you read the accounts, for example, some of your favorite philosophers or artists, they all had some of the most bizarre and funny routines ever. Now, some of these routines, they don't really fit neatly into the category of traditional self-help. There's not really this image of purity. They don't really embody this modern image of like the super self-developed or self-actualized human being. In fact, some of them, they are prone to addictions. They're prone to, these funky habits. I'm not saying that I'm endorsing any of these addictions, veer off of addiction as soon as you could. But I'm simply saying that, isn't it funny how some of the most astute intellectuals, some of the most sort of like acclaimed academics, and some of the most sort of like driving forces in society, they don't exactly conform to this idealized image of the perfect human that self-help would want you to believe. Just think about that for a second. So the Greek idea proposes that you have to check in with yourself constantly. And in fact, this mode of self-control is more difficult to do in real life than it is to subscribe to a whole different system of morality, of giving your responsibility away for another person to tell you what to do and be really self-righteous about it. In fact, this idea of checking in with yourself from a day-to-day basis, this is actually more challenging to do. Imagine if you don't have to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning, but you have to experiment, go through a process of experimentation to come up with your, optimal hour for waking up. That's going to take a lot longer. But then at the end, you're going to feel a lot more in balance with yourself because it's actually based on your own needs. It's not some external solution. So apply this idea to your everyday life. Apply this new idea of self-discipline to some of the stuff that you're doing in your life. And what's going to happen is that there will be a greater sense of sort of like inner harmony. There will be a greater sense of like inner balance, should I say. Because this idea of blindly conforming to some ideal, this is not a vision of balance. This is a vision of, you getting motivated solely by guilt. And this sort of discipline is going to run out one day. You're going to come up with all sorts of excuses because internally you don't actually want to do that thing. Here's the problem. Internally you want to do something else. Hence you need this big part of discipline to like govern this thing that wants to do something else. Whereas what I'm telling you here is that you acknowledge that part that wants to do something else. Yet you try to balance that with your higher aspirations and somehow come up with a middle ground to experiment around with your idea of self-discipline and to come up with an ultimate solution that's somewhere in the middle. Not deadly in the middle, but somewhere in the middle where it fits your needs directly. It's more challenging to do. It's more challenging to operate. And it's going to take a lot longer for you to get used to this idea of self-discipline. But this is the next step of expanding your idea of becoming a better human in this world. That's all I have for this video. Hope you guys had enjoyed it. And like I said before, all of these video scripts and stuff, they will be published on Patreon for patrons. And in fact, every video in the future, they're all going to come with one of these companion scripts with further readings. And thank you for watching. And I will catch you in the next video. Take care.